How do we improve education outcomes, especially in poor countries? Well, one potential solution is by enabling low-fee private schools to flourish. Joining me on the podcast to discuss this topic is Professor James Tooley. Professor Tooley is the author of a number of books, including A Beautiful Tree and Really Good Schools. He's also the Vice Chancellor of the University of Buckingham in the United Kingdom. James Tooley, welcome to Solutions with David Ansara.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here.
Could you start us off with just a brief discussion on how it is that you became interested in this topic?
So David, there is this extraordinary phenomenon going on around the world, which is somewhat well known now. Although when I started this work, it was actually just 2 decades ago, just over 2 decades ago. It was completely unknown, and I came across it. I was doing some work in South Central India, a city called Hyderabad. I was doing some work there on elite private schools. For whatever reason, I'd become an expert on private education. Everyone knew private education was about the rich, the elite in those days. And I was dissatisfied with that approach because I wanted my life to be more about serving the poor, the disadvantaged. Anyway, I wandered into the slums of Hyderabad some 21 years ago with a hunch about what I might find. And we can talk about why I had such a hunch. And then I found this first low-cost a school in the alleyways of a slum, charging in those days about $1 a month, a low-cost private school. Then I found another and another, and soon realized there was this phenomenon which no one had mentioned before, these low-cost private schools serving poor communities and seemingly very attractive to parents. And I then did research on this phenomenon. I got funding from the John Templeton Foundation. Initially did research in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, a couple of parts of India and rural China, and then later added to the list Liberia, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, Somalia, all looking at the same phenomenon. Why? Well, first of all, how many children are going to these schools? The number is enormous. The number is enormous. In a typical country in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, 70 or 80% of poor children in urban areas are going to these schools. These schools outperform those, the children in these schools outperform those in government schools, are affordable to the poor. They're the poor's first choice. And really, this is an extraordinary phenomenon, which is helping meet the needs, the educational needs of the poor. So it's a supremely important phenomenon, been much neglected over the years. Now I think getting more attention, getting the attention it deserves.
So James, one of the things that I find striking about this is often in these environments, public education is free, and yet parents with very low income are sending their children to these private facilities, opting out of the free system. Why is that?
No, it is the big question, isn't it? And it was the big question for me when I first went in to the slums in India and then Nigeria and elsewhere. Why are you sending your children to the government schools when, sorry, why are you sending your children to the private schools when the government schools are free? In India, often there was a free lunch, certainly free books sometimes. And in the private schools, you have to pay. And it may only seem a small amount to us, but if you're poor, no, it's not a small amount. It's quite a large amount. And so parents would tell me using this word or its synonym in the public schools, in the government schools, our children are abandoned. And I remember I have so many trips I've done where I've gone into the government schools and seen how that word applies. You've seen the children sitting on the floor, doing nothing while the teachers sit outside and make tea, chew peanuts, or do other things other than teaching. And actually, it breaks your heart when you see this, when you go into the government schools and you see the children so eager to learn, so eager to welcome an outsider, but abandoned by the teachers. So really, the answer is, why are parents choosing these schools? Because that in the private schools are accountable to them. That's the key phrase. They're accountable to them because they pay fees, and that means that the education within them is better.
So many people, particularly in the West, would look at some of these institutions and say, well, the conditions that the pupils are being taught under are subpar, that they're not acceptable. Sometimes the facilities aren't great. There's maybe a bathroom facility that's off-site. You have to walk down the road to go and use the bathroom. Do you think that that's a significant problem? So even if parents are willingly sending their children there, should we not expect higher standards from these institutions?
Well, I think your example of walking, down the road to the bathroom is more likely to apply to one of the government schools in the poor communities that I've been working in over the years, rather than the private schools. So actually some research has been done which showing that typically these low-cost private schools, even though to you and me, their facilities look substandard, actually they are better than the facilities in the government schools. More often they will have a toilet on site, or they will have separate toilets for boys and girls, or they will have drinking water more often than in the government schools. But I think it's a very important issue that, when we go into these places and look at schools, that we don't carry with us our baggage of only seeing things that might be good enough for us or our children, that we should actually realize that in a community such as the ones we're describing, the communities are poor, the buildings are poor. These schools are typically a step better than the existing schools, often a step better than the government schools, and they are delivering the education quality that is better than in the government schools. Really important somehow to distinguish between the quality of the buildings and the quality of the education. Parents are able to do that. Parents are able to discriminate, and we must not judge these schools by the wrong standards.
Absolutely. Well, it seems that there are many advantages to low-fee private schools, but when we look at the development world, the development aid world, if you will, it seems that a lot of project funding is going towards state-led interventions. Why do you think that there is this kind of state-centric bias amongst the development economists and others in the kind of aid space? Why isn't this potential for low-fee private schools being recognized?
Yes, I mean, it's a very good question. But as I said, and I'm saying this quite frankly, and I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but 20 years ago, before I started this work, and then my teams did this work, no one in the West had heard of this phenomenon of low-cost private schools. It seems incredible now, but it was true. And when I first went back to the World Bank or the British aid agency, DFID, and said about this phenomenon, I was met with just disbelief. So first of all, it's quite a recent phenomenon in aid industry terms to come to terms with. But secondly, there's a lot of ideological objection to this sort of thing from those in the aid industry. There's a lot of ideological objection to the private sector serving the needs of the poor. Now, it's not universal, it's not blanket, but your typical aid expert, your typical development person thinks, well, we want the government schools to be there. We want education to be free. We want education to be in the sort of we could call it the socialist model we're used to, and so people tend to not see these schools as being particularly beneficial. People say if the schools charge fees, then they cannot be pro-poor. And what I always say to people is, you look a parent in the eye, a poor parent who's scrimping and saving a small amount of money to us, a large amount of money to them, to send their child to a private school because they've chosen that school over the government school. You look them in the eye and say, you're not allowed to do this. You are somehow offending our ideology, and you should send your child to the government school. I don't think many people would be able to do that. I think the position is poor parents prefer these schools. Now, look, a couple of things about the government schools. One is, we often think of government schools as being free. I've used that sort of shorthand in some way, and the private schools to cost money. Now, we've done a lot of research. My teams and have done a lot of research in different countries where we've looked at, first of all, the the fees and those official costs of sending a child to a government school and a private school. And then, but also then added the other costs including shoes, uniform, books, transport, lunch, and sometimes informal levies. You add altogether all the other costs and the fees, what you'll find is the cost to a parent of sending a child to a government school is typically around 75% of the cost for a parent of sending a child to a private school. Put it another way, the cost to a private school is 1.3 times more than the cost of sending to a government school. Now, that is more, but it's not that it's massively more. And it's not that if you are the poorest of the poor, you cannot afford to send your child to government school either. So the objection is often, what about the poorest of the poor? Well, the poorest of the poor can't afford government school either. And then you can look at ways of making the private schools more accessible to parents if you wish. So I think you've got to get away from this notion that government schools are free. So aid agencies that are focusing on government schools only are not actually necessarily serving the poorest of the poor. Some aid agencies now have come around and recognized that this sector does exist, that the low-cost private school sector does exist, that it's vibrant, it's massive, and that it has a role to play. So there have been moves to bring aid agencies to move some of the billions of dollars that have gone into government schools, to move some of it across to help these low-cost private schools, but it's a minority. And of course, there's a reaction now against that. Those in the development industry have started to object to the low-cost, to aid agencies working in the low-cost private schools, and have come up with various restrictions on them. There's a famous document called the Abidjan Principles, which sets out the reasons why development agencies should not be involved in low-cost private schools. So I don't know if that's answered your question, but there is this there's an ideological position which is not in favor of parental choice. You see it there amongst the movement for, say, vouchers or school choice in America. Again, you see an ideological inhibition against supporting choice, parental choice of schools, because that somehow offends an egalitarian mentality.
Yeah, I have a few things to say about that. I mean, I think the one would be that you should craft public policy or development policy in this instance with the state you have in mind rather than the state you wish you had. And many developing countries just don't have a capable state, or there are special interests that have captured the machinery of the state. If you consider the South African example, the South African Democratic Teachers Union is very powerful within the tripartite alliance which governs the country. And so they exercise a lot of power politically. And it's very difficult to challenge their power, to impose norms and standards, for example, in the education system. And of course, they have an interest in pushing back against competition as well. So I think there are some very interesting political economy themes that arise out of this.
No, absolutely. And I think what you said at the beginning of that question was absolutely right. You've got to make policy for the state you've got rather than the state you want to have. Time and time I say exactly this to one's critics who say, we want a state system that works and we want to improve the state system, and it's unfair if you don't have a uniform state system. I say the state system in these countries is not working. The state system of education is dysfunctional. Teachers don't turn up, and if they do turn up, they don't teach. There's corruption within the system. And of course, you're right about the vested interests. The teacher unions in many of these countries are very strong, and they allow that indifference, that mediocrity to continue. So you've got to set policy for where you are, but also, in my view, and I'm sure let's see if you agree, you set policy with the interests, you should have a principle that the poor are likely to know what's best for themselves. Now, time and time again, I've given the evidence of poor people choosing low-cost private schools over and above state education. Time and time again, I've given examples of that, and people say, but they're being brainwashed, or they're thinking they want private school because they have nice uniforms. They don't actually realize that they're being hoodwinked or fooled by the proprietors. And that's why the evidence is very, very good. The evidence is very, very strong that achievement and attainment is much better in these private schools than the government schools. The poor are not being ignoramuses. Some government official told me that once. The poor are ignoramuses. They don't realize what's good for them. They send their children to these private schools, which are supposedly good, when really the state sector is much better. The poor are not ignoramuses. They know what they're doing, and achievement is better in these schools. Achievement, attention, these schools are safer for girls. There's far less abuse that goes on, and so on.
Yeah, and I think that often betrays a paternalistic way of thinking about the poor, that we are technocrats, we are highly educated, we know what's best for the poor, and we can direct the state to allocate resources, and then that will improve the lot of these poor passive agents who can't determine their own trajectory of their lives. So I think this discussion really resonates with me in terms of really truly empowering poor people. And interestingly enough, I often find that poor people are a lot more sensitive to differences in price because their income is just so much smaller. They have less discretion, and they're much more sensitive to differences in service across different service providers. I often say that if you had to take an investment banker here in Sandton in Johannesburg and ask them what the price of bread is, they probably wouldn't be able to tell you, but the person sweeping the corridors at the bank would definitely be able to tell you how much the price of the price of a loaf of bread is.
Yes, and that's an interesting point, because what you do see in these in poorer communities across sub-Saharan Africa, across South Asia, Central America, and so on, is that parents will differentiate between what seem very sort of narrow differences in price for the schooling as well, and also be very, very keen on the quality. I've now run several chains of schools across different countries, and I'm aware that the parents are incredibly discerning about what's on offer, and are not fooled, and not particularly, well, the word is not, they're not grateful. You sort of think, well, we've provided a nice school in your area, parents will come here and they'll be grateful for what you provide. No, they'll be grateful if the service is great, and they'll tell you, and they'll pinpoint it, possibly leave if in the worst case, but they'll pinpoint when things are not working. Why was the teacher absent on Friday? Why is the playground still not level? Why are there only 3 computers when we need more? Parents are very discerning. But back to my original point, there's huge gradation in price. And so there are schools that can only be afforded by the slightly richer families, and there are those that can be afforded by the many much poorer families. So yeah, price is a real indicator of quality here.
So we've spoken about the teachers and the students and the parents, but what about the business people, the entrepreneurs who are putting these institutions on the map? What can you tell us about the profile of person who is starting these schools?
So it's quite interesting. I mean, obviously there's huge differences, but one of the perhaps surprising things about my work over the last 2 decades has been how similar the situation is in India to Nigeria, how similar Pakistan to Ghana or whatever. And that actually a few sort of ideal types of entrepreneurs, if you like to put it like that, a few different ideal types emerge. And so one might well be the mother who has, she's got a few kids herself, and she sees the opportunity. Well, I'll have a kindergarten. I'm great with kids. Other mothers like the way I am, and so I'll just bring a few other kids in to create a kindergarten in my little home. And slowly the kindergarten grows and becomes a nursery school, and then the children are ready for grade 1, and the parents will say, but your grade 1 can't be so different from what you're doing with the kindergarten, the nursery children. Why don't we stay with you? And a school will grow up from the bottom up, if you like, starting as for very young kids and growing, and then typically a mother, then those situations will create a school and slowly expand and move out of her home and so on. And another school might come from where someone's been doing coaching classes for the state exams, the class 10, the class 12 exams. Someone's been doing a coaching class and the kids say, well, we learn much more with you than we do in the school. Why don't you open a school? And so a school might start from, as it were, the top down and become in that way. But now I have to say that a lot of people going into it now, because this is such a widespread phenomenon, I can't repeat that often enough. I told you that figure, 70 to 80% of poor children in sub-Saharan Africa, urban areas typically, and in South Asian urban areas are going to private schools. There are estimated 450,000 of these low-cost private schools in India alone, 14,000 in the state of Lagos in Nigeria alone. So it's such a widespread phenomenon. So people now go into it realizing this is a small business that I can get involved in. They've seen the examples, they've seen how successful it is, how obviously this is a lot of these remarks are, we must preface that they're pre-COVID lockdowns, of course. But you see the success of the schools, and so you start a school yourself, you become an entrepreneur. And I've got so much respect for these people who've become entrepreneurs in these areas. I take my hat off to someone who is willing to take that risk with their small amount of savings to create a school, to employ teachers, to take the risk at finding the plot, to employing teachers, to marketing, and having to wait for that day to discover if parents really want what you're offering. What a thing to do. I'm just an immensely brave thing to do, becoming a school entrepreneur. But a lot of people go into it now because they see schools are a suitable small business in their communities.
And what about the content of the child's experience in terms of the curriculum? What is being taught? Because one of the arguments in favor of a state-led approach is that you can have a standardization of the curriculum that enables you to ensure that all kids are graduating with similar levels of proficiency. I'm skeptical of that argument, but I wanted to know what are some of your thoughts about the actual content of what's being taught?
So to tease out those two bits, so obviously you can have a standardized curriculum with very differential outcomes, and that's quite typical of most state systems because you do get the differential outcomes. But look, like you were hinting, I'm also skeptical about the desire for standardized curriculum and assessments. But nonetheless, this would be, if we were putting it in these terms, this would be one of my disappointments about the private education sector in the countries that I've been working in the last 20 years, in that they haven't been able to break away from the state curriculum and assessment systems. Now, these are imposed on them, so my disappointment is not really, it's not a profound disappointment, it's more a realization that the governments impose a national curriculum with national assessments at certain points, and the schools have to meet those in order to get registered by the state. So typically, the private schools follow the national curricula and the national assessment systems. So in a sense, the way you frame the question is actually not incorrect. You can have the regulations of a national curriculum and national assessment system while still having a purely private education system. These regulations are there that you've got to meet, well, then you have to meet them. But I'm sort of, there are some variations around that. And let me see a few things I've seen. So one would be where the national curriculum tries to do too much in the early primary years, the early elementary school years. And so it might cram in, maths and English, but also history and social studies and so on. And so quite a few of the low-cost private schools will say, no, we want to focus on literacy and numeracy first. Those are the basic building blocks of every other subject. So let's focus on those before we start trying to do too much. So that you could see that happening in the schools in the early years. They actually do less than in the public schools, the government schools, but eventually catch up because their children have a much better basis. Another thing that I've seen happen is where the private sector, the private providers, the private entrepreneurs will look at the curriculum and say, conversely, that is far too slow. So the computer curriculum, for example, in Ghana, was incredibly slow because it assumed no one had any access to computers and was just really basically rote learning the parts of a computer and what they do and so on. So I've seen entrepreneurs take that curriculum and say, okay, that 2-year curriculum we can cram into a term, and then let's do something much more interesting, because we do have some computers. We do have the ability for children to be introduced to the technology rather than just told about it as an aside. But overall, private schools do follow the curriculum, do follow the state exams. I would like to see something change. I would like to see, I was in discussion with International Baccalaureate once, you know, the elite school leaving exam, and seeing if we could introduce something like an International Baccalaureate Light, an IB Light, aimed at these low-cost private schools, an alternative assessment system which could perhaps eventually replace the assessment and curriculum of the state.
James, one of the things I've observed is that many people assume that the state, if it is providing welfare to the least advantaged in society, that they also have to provide the service itself. And you can actually decouple those things. You can have private providers actually providing the service and the state still funding that in some way or providing an oversight role. Is that a phenomenon that you've observed as well?
It's a phenomenon that's available in theory, for sure. So you're talking about the possibilities of vouchers or other maybe tax credits or something like this. Now, in my new book, I have a chapter or two on this, and of course the leading light, of course, was Milton Friedman, and he in a 1955 paper he wrote about the possibility of creating a voucher system, a universal voucher system. He not only the possibility but the desirability of doing this. He felt there was a need for universal education. He felt, therefore, the state should tax people and fund a universal voucher for people, but that for children, but that parents could choose typically from a private education, and therefore, as you say, the state would be funding, but the private sector would be delivering and parents would be choosing. Now, it's very interesting that Milton Friedman changed his mind about this. And it's, although the Friedman Foundation, the Rose and Milton Friedman Foundation, carried on promoting education vouchers in America, the founder of the whole idea, changed his mind because what he was introduced to the history of education before the state, particularly in England and Wales, but also with examples from America, from New York State and Massachusetts. And I'll just give you the figures from England, because they're the ones I know better, but we can find the ones from America if you like. The state got involved properly in England in 1870, so 151 years ago, in 1870. But before that, in 1861, a research report, the commission, the Newcastle Commission, had studied what education was actually going on in the state, in England and Wales, before getting the state involved, and it had found around 95% of children were in school for about 6 years. Around 95% of children were in school for 6 years before the state was involved, and they were in schools provided by the church, by other religious groups, by philanthropists, but also, and this was the extraordinary finding from the Newcastle Commission, 58% of the schools providing for the poor, providing for the population, were what the Newcastle Commission called for-profit schools. These were the low-cost private schools that we see nowadays. And that Newcastle Commission report influenced Milton Friedman to realize that actually you didn't need, he had assumed that without the state funding education, you wouldn't have universal or near universal education. And then coming across the history of schooling in England and Wales and then later Americas, he realized that without compulsion, without state funding, you could have near universal provision and demand and supply of schooling. So this is a really important point. So first of all, the work that I've been doing in developing countries supports the historical work, suggesting that you don't need the state in order to provide schooling. But then you come on to this other issue of, can vouchers work? Now, I don't know about you, David, but when I was sort of first thinking about education and different routes, you think, vouchers in America, how exciting. These are an exciting way of delivering something much better for schooling. And I got quite carried away from it, carried away by it, until I started looking at the figures. And then I realized that I looked at this figure from 2015, the percentage of children enrolled on voucher programs, the percentage of all American school children enrolled on voucher programs in America is 0.36%, less than half of 1% of children in America are on vouchers. They have not caught on. And why have they not caught on? Why have people stayed away in droves? Because of some of the issues you were speaking about earlier, the vested interest, the teacher unions have stopped these programs coming forward, even when they seem beneficial, and even when they seem beneficial to poor or marginalized groups in America. So once I start looking at that sort of data, and you can read Milton Friedman's reports of how there was a voucher system in California, which he was really supporting, pouring lots of money into getting it through the various obstacles in the state and really gung-ho about it. And then it didn't happen. The teacher unions quashed it. And I've seen that happen in several states in America. And so vouchers sound exciting. Vouchers sound good. And my only two sort of queries that I want to raise with you. One is, can you really give examples of where they've worked anywhere? Sweden and Chile are two examples, and they're, in a sense, what you might say they're the rare examples that really are unlikely to be copied anywhere else. But vouchers themselves, a tiny number of American children, a tiny proportion, stopped by the vested interests. And in any case, the person who was most in favor of them changed his mind when he realized historically, and now we can realize contemporary research across developing countries, you do not need the state in order to provide near universal education coverage. That was a long answer, I know, to your question, but I think it's an important one to get clear.
So would you say that rather than the state playing this central role in welfare provision, that it should actually reduce the barriers to entry and allow some of these emergent private institutions to fill the gap and fill the need?
Yes, I mean that's the ideal position. And now, I'm not saying it's going to happen. In many of the countries around the world, the states, the governments are not in favor of private schools. In certain countries they are, and they recognize that actually they could not possibly meet the demand. They could not afford to meet the demand if all the children who were in private schools wanted to come into state schools. It would cost, in Lagos State, for example, I think the estimate was it would cost many billions of dollars per annum to move those children across from the private system to the state system. They can't afford to do it, and they recognize the schools as partners. But typically they don't recognize them. And, an argument is always, yes, deregulate, stop forcing inappropriate regulations on private schools so they can't operate in the ways that can really liberate the education of poorer people. So typically states want to regulate teacher salaries, teacher qualifications, teacher certification. These things are not needed in order to bring about high quality education. Typically, states want to regulate playground size. So you need a 1 acre playground if you're in the slums. Not possible to do. So just what I'm saying, the states need to, yes, they do need to deregulate. But even in our countries, in certain American states, it's very easy to open a private school. In others, it's pretty difficult. And when I opened a relatively low-cost private school up north in England, in Durham, it took us 485 days to get registered. Quite a lot of bureaucracy to go through, quite a lot of unexpected bureaucracy to go through, moving at a very slow, with the government moving at a very slow pace. So yes, I would much rather see the sector being liberated in this way.
So James, one of the key reasons why people go to school in the first place is not just for skills acquisition. Numeracy and literacy are obviously important, but also to develop their character. Do you think that schools in this model, this low-fee private school model, maybe miss out on certain features of public schooling, like imparting a sense of civic education and responsibility, for example? Do you think that if it's purely about just going to the most cost competitive provider, that this almost sets up education as being this transactional thing, just any other service? Do you think that that's an overstated concern? And do you think that perhaps low-fee private institutions do actually provide the service?
Yeah, I think it is an exaggerated concern. I mean, first of all, again, let's go back to what we were saying earlier. Let's focus on the government schools we have, and the government schools we have in the countries I'm describing do not inculcate these civic values. They have teachers who don't turn up. If they do turn up, they're not necessarily teaching. They inculcate a lot of bad habits, the idea of being a free rider, of of the acceptability of corruption, of the acceptability of or the the realization that a government job doesn't mean you have to do much, and so on. So first of all, those schools don't necessarily provide it. In all these countries, there would typically be a civics curriculum, or but I'm not suggesting that's really worth particularly much. But I think in the private schools, you see the benefit of a community in operation. You see teachers who care for their children and are responding in appropriate ways. But but that's all anecdotal. And there, to my knowledge, there are only small scale studies that have been done that have actually looked at this question. However, in America, there are studies that have been done about this, and they have found that in terms of student responses on civic understanding questionnaires and so on, controlling for background variables, so this isn't a wealth phenomenon, they have found that that children in the private schools have a higher sense of civic value, have a higher degree of civic awareness than children in the government schools. So there's very interesting research on that, and I believe there's a study going on as we speak. I know this because the researcher who's engaged in it is coming to work with me here at the University of Buckingham. He's a Harvard postdoc at the moment, and that work is ongoing, again, looking at now a meta-analysis of all the studies out there. Let's see what they come up with. But so anecdotally, I don't think it's true what you're saying, but in research terms, I think there are now emerging studies which show this is not the case either. In America, my guess is it's not true around the world too.
Yeah, and I think one of the counters to that would be that sometimes if the state has a monopoly on the provision of education, it actually uses that power to reinforce dominant norms in society, which may not actually be beneficial. So if you consider many countries, particularly in the Muslim world, have traditionally been quite hostile to women and girls going through the education system, whereas a low-fee provider might be able to emerge to satisfy that need and be able to provide education to young girls.
Thank you for reminding me of that. That's a really important point. And in my latest book, and part of it, I talk about how governments in countries like Sudan, like Liberia, like Sierra Leone, like countries that have been through this experience of conflict, often it is catalogued, and not catalogued by me, but catalogued by aid and development agencies, that the government curriculum, the government imposition was actually leading to was one of the causes of civil conflict. In Sudan, it was imposing a particular Islamic curriculum, and the South Sudanese wanted to break away from that and become a ostensibly at least, a different state which could allow a different sort of curriculum. In Liberia and Sierra Leone, again, you'd have the dominant class imposing a particular type of curriculum, which was perhaps favoring one tribal group over another. You saw the same in Zimbabwe when I was a young man as a teacher there, where the government curriculum, it was said, this is going back to memories, was sort of in favor of the Shona at the expense of the Ndebele. But this is a common phenomenon. So that was anecdotal about Zimbabwe, but it's now well documented in many countries that have been in conflict, that governments push a certain line which leads to civic degeneration, civic disruption, not the sort of thing that you're talking about there. So I think it's a really important point and well stated.
And the most prominent example of this was Malala Yousafzai. I think that is how you pronounce her name. The young girl at the time who was shot for trying to attend a school in Pakistan, in the remote mountainous regions there. And I think I actually saw somewhere that she was attending a private institution. Is that correct?
Yes. In fact, this is the opening paragraph of my new book, Really Good Schools. I focus on Malala, and I say, everyone knows Malala. She's the youngest person to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. She's often held up as this icon of someone in favor of public education, state education. She's certainly used in that way by the teacher unions, by the international agencies. And I had a hunch when I heard of her story and I read her autobiography. And it's absolutely clear the school she was on her way to when she was shot by the Taliban. The story is that her father was the headmaster. No, her father wasn't the headmaster. Her father was the entrepreneur who had created this low-cost private school, one of 400 low-cost private schools in the Swat Valley part of Pakistan. And in fact, Malala is there as our most famous, if you like, the most famous product of low-cost private schools in South Asia. And the private schools can take her as our icon. She is part of what the private schools have delivered and produced.
Absolutely. Now, James, just as we draw this conversation to a close, you're the Vice Chancellor of the University of Buckingham. Do you see similar disruptive trends in the world of higher education? What are you hoping to achieve at the University of Buckingham?
So I've been in this role 9 months, almost to the day, as we speak now. So I'm quite new to this. In a sense, I was an accidental Vice Chancellor. I was enjoying this work that we've been describing and talking about today. It was very fulfilling, but for whatever reason, the university asked me to take on this role, and I'm happy to take it on. But yes, I do see disruptive approaches. Now, first of all, obviously, there's the whole online learning, which we're all used to in a way that we weren't before. But I think in terms of cost too, and one of my 7 mantras that I'm talking about a lot as I come here is affordability and accessibility. I want to see how I can make programs here less expensive for students, lower in cost than the ones in the state sector here. We're a private independent university here in England, one of the few. I want to see if I can reduce our fees, but more likely for us here, we can have income sharing agreements or income contingent loans, whereby, if you like, there's a third partner involved, the student, the university, and a loan company or a non-banking finance company. The non-banking finance company pays the fees to the university. The student then has a contract with that company and pays back some proportion of their income over so many years, 8% over 8 years, something like that. And in that way, anyone who's got the required background, if you like, the required grades, we normally say, can come to a university on the expectation that when they start earning, their university education will put them in good stead, that they can pay back a loan. It could be a transaction, an intergenerational transfer if our alumni are a part of that finance company I've described. So there are exciting things going on. I hope to be able to, these are all just off the record for now, but they will be exciting things one can notice and learn about in the future.
Well, I'm looking forward to learning more about that. I mean, personally, I think the higher education sector is ripe for disruption, particularly in the United States and Britain, where you have a lot of this fee inflation that's happening, these growing bureaucracies around these traditional institutions, and also students not necessarily being exposed to the skills that are needed. And this, I guess, it's maybe a culture in many societies that if you haven't gone to university, then you're not really part of the upper elite, and your pathway to middle class status might be blocked or frustrated.
Yeah.
Do you share some of those sentiments?
Yeah, I very much share those sentiments. And I'll just give you one example of what the University of Buckingham did 50 years ago. Now, this was innovation 50 years ago, but still pretty exciting stuff, really. And that was, it recognized that for an undergraduate, typically in England, universities close in June and then they don't open again until October. In different parts of the world, the months are different, but the general principle that for a third of the year, universities are closed. And we said, well, actually, that's great if you can have time to have a leisurely stroll through this, or you want to do traveling, or you want to do something else. But for many students, we're in more of a hurry. And so we actually said, well, let's fill that summer break with a term, another term. And so we have 4 terms a year, which means we can cover all the content for a degree in 2 years, which means, of course, already we're starting to do that disruption about cost, because our fees are slightly higher than the state sector at the moment, but you only have to pay 2 years of them rather than 3 years. Start working earlier. So actually, we're much cheaper than the state sector. And that's a sort of disruption of saying, well, there's not just one model for a university. Why do we have that model where we have these long sessions which don't benefit the student? And universities are special. They have a special relationship between student and the academics, but nonetheless, the student's interests should count highly. Maybe universities don't focus on that enough, and we do at the University of Buckingham.
Well, James, Tooley, I think that's an appropriate point to end the conversation, but I just wanted to thank you very much. I really enjoyed this discussion. I think that it is so interesting to see what is happening in parts of the world that might be less well off, but where there's a high degree of innovation and really embracing the potential for decentralized, low fee, competitive education. I think there's so much potential there. And I wanted to thank you for joining us on Solutions with David Ansara.
Thank you so much for having me on here, David. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.